Hello, this is Douglas Rumbaugh. In this video, I thought I would start doing something a little bit different, a little bit interesting. This has absolutely nothing to do with computers. So, I've been lately getting relatively interested in classical studies just as a hobby. Uh, that side of the bookshelf has a whole bunch of Greek and Roman and stuff books up there. And I started reading the Metamorphoses by Ovid, this guy here. And I thought it would be fun to go through this epic poem and read through it and provide some commentary, right? So some layperson commentary. Me, who knows a little bit but not a ton about this, might be interesting to see what I can come up with so far as commentary goes on something like this. So I'm going to start reading through this. Now, the Metamorphoses are nice for something like this because it's not, well, what would be the best way to say this? It's made up of a whole bunch of short stories, basically. They're connected. It's one grand narrative of sort of the history of the world from creation on up to Ovid's time, the early empire, early imperial Roman period. But it's broken up into a whole bunch of short stories that can kind of be tackled individually to a certain degree. So it makes it pretty easy to break it apart. Now, at the very beginning of book one, Ovid provides basically the story of the creation of the universe. And so I'm going to run through the first couple pages of book one on the creation of the universe here and provide some additional commentary as we go. So I am using the Barnes and Noble Classics edition. It's translated by Frank Miller with some modernization of language. The Miller translation is quite old, so Robert Squillis went through and modernized some of the language. Now, I believe actually the Miller translation is also the one you get from the Loeb Classical Library here. Miller, yeah, the Miller translation on those as well. So the Loeb books are nice. As a matter of fact, let me just grab this preemptively because I may want to pull it out. The Loeb books are nice because they have the original language and English on opposite facing pages here. So just to open it up randomly, we have Latin on one side, English on the other. So it's very easy to reference. See if you can figure out what the original Latin words were at certain points, which, believe it or not, I have actually done with this because there are some kind of interesting translations. Anyway, let's get into it. So, book one. My mind is bent to tell of bodies changed into new forms. O gods, for you yourselves have wrought the changes, breathe on these my undertakings, and bring down my song in unbroken strains from the world's very beginning, even unto the present time. Now that first paragraph is it's an invocation to the Muse. It's a fairly standard. Well, these exact words aren't standard, but the form is fairly standard at the beginning of epic poems. So you'll see one at the beginning of the Iliad, one at the beginning of the Odyssey, one at the beginning of the Aeneid. I think Byron has one at the beginning of John Juin. So it's a fairly standard opening for an epic poem. And that kind of sets the stage for what we're working with. This is, although it's not one cohesive narrative in the way that, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey is, this is in the genre of epic poetry. Of course, the translation is not at all, well, it's not, it's prose, a prose translation, but translating poetry is always tricky. Anyway. Before the sea was, and the lands, and the sky that hangs over all, the face of nature showed alike in her round, which state have men called chaos, a rough, unordered mass of things, nothing at all but lifeless bulk and warring seeds of ill-matched elements heaped in one. No sun as yet shone forth upon the world, nor did the waxing moon renew her slender horns, nor yet did the earth hang poised by her own weight in the circumambient air. nor had the ocean stretched her arms along the far reaches of the lands. And, though there was both land and sea and air, no one could tread that land or swim that sea, and the air was dark. No form of things remained the same, all objects were at odds, for within one body cold things strove with hot, and moist with dry, soft things with hard, and things having weight with weightless things. So this is the initial state of the universe. And it's interesting looking at, say, creation myths cross-culturally, that very rarely, if ever, I can't think of one off the top of my head where creation occurs from literally nothing. There's always something there, and particularly in this more European, not necessarily European, I guess, I want to say Western. That's kind of a vague term, but the Mesopotamia and Egypt and up into Greece and Rome and all that, they tend to start the universe in some state of, well, what the Greeks called chaos. And I believe Ovid here does a pretty good job of laying out what chaos is. It's the natural state of things. Everything's crammed together. And what's interesting too is it's not always directly chaos. It's not the word chaos isn't always used directly. A lot of the times it's water. So as an example, actually, let me mark my place there. As an example, here's a pretty standard creation myth. And I'm using myth in the technical sense, don't get angry. So if we look at Genesis 1, very first couple lines of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form, that sounds kind of familiar, and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So notice we see in Genesis 1, in the Hebrew creation myth, that we have waters. And I believe you say the same thing in the Babylonian myth. I'm actually not super familiar with the Egyptian one, but I would hazard a guess that you probably see the same thing there too. And classically, the element water is associated with chaos. So chaos and water, in the context of these sort of creation myths, they're kind of two words for the same thing. Two different words for the same thing, the same concept. It's interesting to consider the fact that in all of these myths, you start with something, and that something then gets ordered to give you the universe as it exists now. And that's what Ovid's about to go into here. It seems perhaps interesting that we would start the story of the creation of the universe would start with effectively a universe already there. It makes sense in the case of the Metamorphoses because, as I'm sure you can guess from the name of this poem, we're going to be seeing a whole bunch of transitions. Things change from one state to another. And so too with the beginning of the universe as it starts, and then we're going to change it into the universe as we see it now. But if you really think about it, the concept of nothing is kind of weird. It's difficult to conceptualize nothing. Even if you close your eyes and you say, imagine a big black space, well, surely that's nothing. Say, chunk of interstellar space or void or something like that. I mean, you still have space. It's still black. Black is something. And the way you're imagining it, there's probably time of some sort. Time is something. So the idea of absolutely nothing is tricky. It's hard to conceptualize something like that. And so it makes sense that a lot of the older creation myths would actually start with something. Because even if it's not nothing, it's close enough. So we have this chaotic mess of everything. All the stuff that's in the universe is there, but it's all evenly mixed together. You have cold things within hot things and weightless things in with weighty things, and it's just a mess. So from that, we have God, or kindlier nature, composed this strife, for he rent asunder land from sky and sea from land, and separated the ethereal heavens from the dense atmosphere. When thus he had released these elements and freed them from the blind heap of things, he set them each in its own place and bound them fast in harmony. The fiery weightless element that forms heaven's vault leapt up and made a place for itself upon the topmost height. Next came air in lightness and in place. The earth was heavier than these, and, drawing with it the grosser elements, sank to the bottom by its own weight. The streaming water took the last place of all, and held the solid land confined within its embrace. Now, here, my very first thought on reading this paragraph was we see God, capital G, God. And this God is mentioned a few more times during this initial section, and apparently never again. So there is a God here. And I was curious because obviously this is from before Christianity was a significant factor in the Roman Empire, and Ovid certainly wasn't Christian. But a lot of these translations of early Roman texts throw capital G God around. You actually see it in some of the Greek stuff as well. And part of that I've always thought part of that's probably just the Christian bias of the people translating it, trying to make that connection there. Now, I did go and look up the exact word that is translated as God in this particular passage. And let me see if I can find that passage here. Metamorphoses, Book 1. Deus. So this here, I'm not going to attempt. My Latin pronunciation sucks. I'm not going to attempt to read this, but it is... Let's see if I can get this focused. Sort of. It is the word Deus, right there. That's the one that's translated as God. So it is that word, lowercase d, not capital D, but it is the word Deus that gets translated there. And what Ovid probably means is not the Christian God Yahweh. It's probably more of like the Platonic orderer of the universe. I always pronounce it as demiurge. I think it's pronounced differently, but that's how I pronounce it. I've only ever seen it in writing. I haven't really heard it spoken, so you know how that goes. But say that more of the demiurge, the Platonic ordering principle of the cosmos, more so than the Hebrew God. So anyway, this demiurge comes in and separates out the different components of this chaotic mess. And we also see here the classical elements. Fiery weightless element goes to the top, then air, and then water, and then earth. So that's sort of the order of the elements. Confusingly, he screws around with the ordering a little bit and talks about earth at first and then water is last in that paragraph. But it says earth went to the bottom and then water held in place the land. So one would imagine the water on top of. And that's the conventional order of the elements. It's not weight per se. It's different. It's more the principle by which the elements sort themselves out. So fire is the highest, and then air, and then water, and then earth. And I don't know, you're probably familiar with this already, but this is why in classical physics meaning like Aristotelian physics, not Newtonian. This is why, say, if you drop a rock into some water, right, the rock sinks to the bottom because earth finds its place below water. So the earth is going to sink through to the bottom of the water. And if it releases water bubbles as it goes, or air bubbles rather as it goes, those are going to float up to the top because air's place is higher than water. And if you light a fire, the flames and smoke are going to go up through the air because fire is seeking a position higher than air does. So that's the deal with the four classical elements. That's kind of how Aristotle would have explained gravity, right? Gravity is just the fact that this pen, say, is Earth, and Earth's seeking a natural place lower than the air. So when you drop it, it goes according to its nature into the appropriate spot in the grand order of things. Anyway, when he, whoever of the gods it was, had thus arranged in order and resolved that chaotic mass, and reduced it, thus resolved, to cosmic parts, he first molded the earth into the form of a mighty ball, so that it might be of like form on every side. He then bade the waters to spread about, to rise in waves beneath the rushing winds and fling themselves around the shores of the encircled earth. Springs, too, and huge stagnant pools and lakes he made, and he hemmed down-flowing rivers with their shelving banks, whose waters, each far remote from each, are partly swallowed by the earth itself, and partly flow down to the sea, and being thus received into the expanse of freer flood, beaten out on the shores instead of banks. Then did he bid plains to stretch out, and valleys to sink down, and woods to be clothed in leafage, and the rock-ribbed mountains to arise. And as the celestial vault is cut by 2 zones on the right and 2 on the left, there is a 5th zone between, hotter than these, so did the providence of God mark off the enclosed mass with the same number of zones, and the same tracts were stamped upon the earth. The central zone of these may not be dwelt in by reason of heat, deep snow covers 2, and 2 he placed between, did give them a temperate climate, mingling heat with cold. Now the first part of that's fairly straightforward. The last bit, though, I did have to look that one up because I'd not heard of that before. But it's the 5 zones of the Earth, so to speak. So it's not clear where this idea came from. I believe the earliest reference to it that I found was in Aristotle. The basic idea is that you can think of the Earth as being set up in 5 stripes, if you will. Five climate zones might be a way of thinking about it. So, and of course the Earth is a ball. Earth is a sphere. Everyone knew that. Put that from your mind. So you have basically the poles, which are very cold. Then you have temperate zones, and then you have the middle hot zone, which is the equator. So of course the Greeks and the Romans would not have traveled particularly far south, say across the Sahara Desert or anything like that. So they really had no idea, to my knowledge, what was, say, below the equator, south of the equator. But they kind of extended their experience and assumed it would be mirrored. And of course it, to a degree, is. So you have the polar regions are cold and the equatorial region is hot. Now, of course, it's not inhabitable, but they thought that it would be inhabitable. And then you have the temperate zones, say Europe is in one of those temperate zones where cold is mixed with hot and the situation is adequate for sustaining life, say. So that's just a model of the climate zones of the Earth. Not so much as broad. I originally thought that was some sort of like a cosmic model or something like that, but it is literally just the climates of the Earth. Cold, warm, hot, warm, cold. The air hung over all, which is as much heavier than fire as the weight of water is lighter than the weight of earth. So again, we have fire is lighter than air. But again, this isn't weight in the traditional, or isn't weight in the modern physical sense. It's something different. There did the Creator bid the mists and clouds to take their place, and thunder that should make the hearts of men, and winds which the thunderbolts make chilling cold. To these also the world's Creator did not allot the air that they might hold it everywhere. Even as it is, they can scarce be prevented, though they control their blasts, each in his separate tract, from tearing the earth to pieces. So fiercely do these brothers strive together. But Eros drew off the land of dawn and the realms of Araby, where the Persian hills flush beneath the morning light. The western shores which glow with the setting sun are the place of Zephyrus, while bristling Boreas betook himself to Scythia and the farthest north. The land far opposite is wet with constant fog and rain, home of Auster, the south wind. Above these he placed the liquid, weightless ether, which has no trace of earthly dregs. So here we have basically the four winds. And those names, Zephyrus, Auster, Boreas, and Urus. I'm not particularly good with my Greek pronunciation either. Those were the gods of the four winds. Zephyrus, of course, Zephyr. That's a fairly common word. And Boreas, I know. Every time I see Boreas, I always think of the Waterhouse painting of the same name. So those are the winds. And then, of course, we have the ether, which is the fifth element, if you will, the above fire even, that constitutes the heavens. Here spelled E-T-H-E-R. Often you'll see an A thrown in there for good measure, too. Scarce had he thus parted off all things within their determined bounds, when the stars, which had long been lying hid, crushed down beneath the darkness, began to gleam throughout the sky. And that no region might be without its forms of animate life, the stars and divine forms occupied the floor of heaven, the sea fell to the shining fishes for their home, earth received the beasts, and the mobile air the birds. So there we have the creation of living things. A living creature of finer stuff than these, more capable of lofty thought, one who could have dominion over all the rest, was lacking yet. Then man was born. Whether the God who made all else, designing a more perfect world, made man of his own divine substance, or whether the new earth, but lately drawn away from the heavenly ether, retained still some elements of its kindred sky, that earth which the son of Iaptus mixed with fresh running water, and molded into the form of all controlling gods. And, though all other animals are prone, and fix their gaze upon the earth, he gave to man an uplifted face, and bade him stand erect and turn his eyes to heaven. So then the earth, which had but lately been a rough and formless thing, was changed and clothed itself with forms of men before unknown. And so there we have the first creation of humanity. There's actually, depending on how you count them, I think there's 2 or 3 different creations of man, or humanity, I guess, in this first book. But that is the first with this nameless demiurge. Now, after that, we're going to get into the standard, or not the standard, but now we're going to get into the more traditional Greek gods. So the capital G God that we had with us for now is going to basically go away. We're not going to see him again. Going into the next section here. And actually, I think that's probably a good place to stop this first video. So in the next one, we'll start talking about, and the golden was that first age. We'll see Jove, otherwise known as Jupiter, otherwise known as Zeus, and some of the other gods of that form. So I hope that you found this somewhat interesting. I sure did. This is a very interesting poem. There's a lot to it. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, in the last paragraph we encountered Iapetus. So that would be Iapetus, something like that. Iapetus. That is... Who was that? I looked this up, but I forgot. I think it's, if not a Titan, it's a child of one of the Titans. Let me just quickly Google that name. To be honest with you, I didn't see an obvious reason for why that name of anyone should be mentioned here. Yeah, it's a Titan. Son of Uranus and Gaia, father of Atlas, Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Menoetius. Alright, so yeah, it's a Titan. father of Prometheus. And of course, we're going to see Prometheus. Oh, it helps if you read carefully, doesn't it? That Earth, which the son of Iapetus. Yeah. So that paragraph is talking about Prometheus, isn't it? That would make a lot more sense, wouldn't it? Anyway. So yeah, we're talking about Prometheus there, which does make sense. I'm now rambling, so we will call it quits for now, and in the next one we'll dive into the next part of book 1 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. So hopefully you found this interesting, and hopefully I'll see you in that one.